Okay, so I want to start first with just a little bit that's kind of left over from last time. Um, I mean, I talked about this some, but I didn't say everything I wanted to say about it. So, uh, which is about, like why, well, at least to begin with, why Kuhn isn't satisfied with the terminology of seeing versus looking at. Ray, that is why he feels pressed to go further and say the world has changed. It's a different world. Um, so, um, so here's one place he talks about it. At the very least, as a result of discovering oxygen, Lavoisier saw nature differently. So that's still the right. That's saw nature differently means like we're still looking at nature, but we're seeing it differently. So that's why it's at the very least he saw it differently. But then he goes on, and in the absence of some recourse to that hypothetical fixed nature that he quotes saw differently, the principle of economy will urge us to say that after discovering oxygen, Lavoisier worked in a different world. Now, I don't know about the principle of economy. That's kind of, I'm not sure exactly what that's doing there. Doesn't seem like the right principle. But anyway, what he's saying is um, we have no access to some fixed nature that's the same no matter how you see it. So it doesn't make sense to say like in particular in this case we don't there's no recourse. He loves that word recourse. Also recur, he likes to say a lot. There's no recourse. I translated that to access. It's not maybe exactly the same, but yeah, we can't appeal to some hypothetical fixed thing that Lavoisier first saw one way and then saw the other way. Because our best description, should Kuhn really say this? That science gives us our best description of what the world is like? I don't know. In other words, why not say the hypothetical fixed nature is the one that's seen by artists or engineers or something like that, not by scientists? But in any case, you can understand what he's thinking. We have no scientific description of nature that hasn't changed in this shift, so we have no description of what the nature is that Lavoisier was looking at both before and after. So, um, and uh, that that problem comes out in Kuhn's comparison between what happens in a scientific revolution and a so-called Gestalt switch. A Gestalt, Gestalt in German actually means shape, but in English, Gestalt means a certain kind of perceptual whole um, that you either see all together or you don't see it all. You can't see it piece by piece. And so, right, and this is the example that everyone discusses, the duck rabbit. So, um, you know, I should put that high a little bit. That's, yeah, better. You know, so you can see it as a rabbit facing that way, or you can see it as a duck facing that way. You can't really see it as both at the same time, probably. At least I can't. Most people can't. I don't know if maybe some people can. You can't really see it as both a duck and a rabbit at the same time. And but you can switch from one to the other. Like maybe the first time you see it, you think it's a duck and you don't notice that you could also see it as a rabbit. But someone can point out to you, well, see that as an ear, and it's facing that way. But you don't like, you don't build it up by kind of first seeing the rabbit ear and then the eye, and then it switches all at once. And I mean, it's supposed to be related to the general thesis of Gestalt psychology. I guess it's called Gestalt psychology because they especially talk about shapes, that, the idea that you first see the circle and only afterwards maybe see the individual parts of the circle's outline, right? As opposed to thinking that you see the circle by seeing this, and realizing it's a circle. All right. So anyway, so we have this duck rabbit example. So Kuhn says this is like what happens in science because it's sudden and unstructured, the switch. It's not piecemeal, right? Like we don't gradually gather evidence that this is a rabbit. Um, I mean, something happens that's kind of gradual, yes, but until it's finished, you still only see the duck. What happens gradually is someone points out, like, oh, but you could, look at it this way, look at it that way, and uh, at some point you get it, and then you see the rabbit, and then you don't see the duck anymore. But Kuhn says a scientific revolution is not like this in two ways. Number one, it's not reversible, right? So the duck rabbit switch is reversible. First, you see it as a duck, then you see it as a rabbit. Now you can go back to seeing it as a duck. Whereas the scientific revolution is not reversible, right? Like Lavoisier can't go back to seeing it as dephlogisticated air, whatever it is. And that, I mean, that's the right, that's the problem. What is it? Um, and that's the second way that the duck rabbit is not like a scientific revolution. In a scientific revolution, we can't say what it is that's now being seen a different way. Right? Whereas in the case of the duck rabbit, we can say what it is. It's these lines and this dot on the chalkboard were first seen as a duck and then seen as a rabbit. Um, right, here's Kuhn's explanation of why this is different. This is on page 114. Um, aware that nothing in his environment has changed, he is the male, apparently, subject of a Gestalt demonstration. Aware that nothing in his environment has changed, he directs his attention increasingly not to the figure, duck or rabbit, but to the lines on the paper he is looking at. I mean, does that really happen when you first see this example? I don't know about that, but anyway, actually, it's actually important. I shouldn't dismiss that. Is that really what happens? But anyway, Kuhn is saying that what happens is that you see the duck, then you see the rabbit. You're a little confused, but to figure out what happened, you say, well, look, I've been looking at the same thing the whole time. What is it really I was looking at? And then you pay attention to the lines on the dot. Maybe that's a little bit more true with, you know, this example, which is less entertaining, right? Where you can see the cube as coming out that way or as coming out the other way. Um, that at some point maybe you stop and say, okay, what's really going on here? What am I really seeing? Well, there's like a diamond here, and there's like a triangle, and I mean, yeah, I don't know. But all right. So any case, like whether it's really true that you increasingly fix your intention on that or not, it's definitely true in the duck rabbit case. Like you're not you're not at a loss of words to say what happened. You know what you were looking at, and you can explain what it was. Um, and this kind of awareness that nothing has changed, that it really is something I was looking at the whole time, and I just have to focus on that to explain what happened, um, is Kuhn describes this as an external standard or authority that we can appeal to in this case. Um, it's this is the role that would be provided by neutral sense data if we were describing a scientific revolution, right? Where we could say, well, Lavoisier's sense data were the same before and after, but the interpretation was different, right? In Husserlian terminology, you would say the hyletic data has not changed. um, so, but Kuhn says, like all efforts to develop a neutral sense data language have failed. So, and so I guess by induction, we should assume they're all going to fail. I don't know. Anyway, um, he takes the project of describing in neutral terms what we sense without importing any um, paradigm as hopeless. Um, so whereas in the duck rabbit example, um, we happen to have a neutral explanation of it. I think that's what you have to say at this point, really. It's kind of like just lucky that we have a neutral explanation of this. Uh, it, you know, Whereas in this case, we happen to have a neutral description of it. In the case of a scientific revolution, we never have a neutral description of it. Um, and again, that's why Kuhn says, um, well, it's both why he says it's we want to say that we now work in a different world, that scientists are now in a different world, because we can't, it seems you want to say that something hasn't changed, but we can't say what it is. um, and it's also why he wants to say, or why he says in the scientific revolution, uh, there's no recourse to a higher standard. Um, so there can't be reasoned arguments about what to do at this point. Now, I mean, I just want to point something else out about this example or describe this example in a different way. This is just kind of a side note because this is the way I would talk about what's happening in this example. So, uh, like, uh, first of all, it's important to remember that this is, I mean, it's not really right to call it a duck rabbit. It's a duck picture, rabbit picture, right? Like if I brought in a cage here and there was an animal like hopping around in it, and you're like, oh, that's a rabbit. And then I said, no, but see, this is the beak. And all of a sudden, it was a duck. You wouldn't know what to say. It happened, right? Like that would be really surprising. No doubt. Right. So, um, right. So, I mean, it's uh, it's not the concept of duck and rabbit that are involved here, but the concept duck picture and rabbit picture. Um, and you know, what we learn when we make the switch, we learn that those concepts are not really useful in classifying nature. The concept duck picture and rabbit picture, right? Because here's the thing that we can't say which it fits under. They're supposed to be mutually exclusive. They're supposed to be part of a classification of things we could see on the blackboard. And yet here's a case that um, can't be filed in that classification. So, um, so this is an example. I was talking about this to some people after class last time. This is an example actually of a kind of imminent critique of a concept, of two concepts. It's not without appeal to external authority. We know they're not good anymore because we can't classify things using them. So like even if we can't, and it's pretty hard to see this as neither a duck nor a rabbit. At least, I mean, my picture's not that great, but but I think once I tell you to see it as a duck or a rabbit, it's pretty hard to go back to seeing it as just a line and a, you know, like a funny shaped curve and a dot. Um, so like we may not be able to see it other than as a duck and as a rabbit, but we know that that is a duck picture or a rabbit picture. But we know that what we're looking at is not a duck picture or a rabbit picture because those concepts, duck picture and rabbit picture, have failed us. Um, and um, and so first of all, that's not reversible, right? Like once the switch from duck to rabbit is reversible, but the switch from thinking that everything um that something on the board can be a duck picture or a rabbit picture, but not both, is not reversible. Once you see this example, you know. um and it seems like it's possible to explain or to understand at least some examples of revolutionary change in science in this way, right? Like in the transition to special relativity, the concept of simultaneity, right? Like one event happened here and one event happened here, and we want to know, did they happen at the same time? Right? So like before Einstein, it was thought that simultaneity in that sense was a perfectly good concept for understanding the world. Pairs of events can be classified as simultaneous or not simultaneous. But it turns out that it's not. Right? Like it doesn't make sense to ask whether two events at distinct places happen simultaneously or not, because if they're simultaneous and to one observer, they won't be simultaneous to other observers. And again, it's not reversible because um, once you know the concept of simultaneous is no good, you can't use it anymore. All right, that's similar. I could say something similar about the concept of the center, right? Which is the most important concept in Aristotelian dynamics. Everything either, so to speak, falls freely towards the center or away from the center or around the center. But before we even have Newtonian mechanics, we have, you know, Galileo observes satellites of Jupiter. So, I mean, they're not going around the Earth or the sun, they're going around Jupiter. So there's no longer at any point that could be assigned as the center. So that concept has, you know, has like failed to fit onto the world in a certain way that we can recognize without being able to say what, without having an external standard to compare to. All right. Anyway, that's just that was just my side note. Now I'm going to go on to talk about the new material here, unless there's questions about any of that. Okay. So so the new material, first of all, Kuhn talks about how revolutions end. I think I've already discussed this several times, but there's some details here that are worth talking about. So So because, and he's already said this before, really, in previous chapters, because the two sides talk past each other, the revolution, so I mean, the revolution, I mean, a revolution is only a revolution once it succeeds, right? Before that, it's like it's a civil war. So there's two sides fighting each other. And again, Kuhn at least, um, I guess he says this explicitly. He certainly implies that sometimes the old paradigm will win. I'm not sure if he has examples of that. Like we're a new paradigm, because the way he describes things, you should, I guess, I don't know what you should expect now from this point of view, but it seems like you should kind of expect that sometimes the old paradigm will win. Um, but it's hard. I don't know if there's really examples of that where a new paradigm really gets started. Yeah.
I don't think that he really explains this as like a new paradigm getting started, but he does have the example of the contention about gravity being in a full force and them trying to find a mechanical function for gravity, failing and reverting to accepting Newtonian gravity as something that's effectively in a full force for a time.
Right. Well, at least the way he describes that, and I don't know if he's right. I mean, he knows a lot more about the history of science than I do. And on the other hand, like real historians of science think that he doesn't know that much. So it's kind of, but at least the way he describes it, those were those people looking for a mechanical, well, yeah, it's complicated. Newton himself like kind of says that there must be a mechanical explanation, but he also says he's not gonna propose one. I think that's basically what he means by when he says he's not gonna make hypotheses. Uh, but um, but at least the way Kuhn tells it, that's like a kind of rearguard action by the mechanists, you know, like uh, we can't have occult forces, so like whatever Newton's seen must have a mechanical explanation. I guess that's the way Kuhn. I don't know actually. So that is a weird example. Doesn't it? Yeah, in a sense. I mean, if their mechanical explanation produces exactly Newton's law of universal gravitation, then that would really,
Yeah, it's hard to classify.
yeah, that would have been a different way that the Newtonian paradigm could have gone, or something like that. I think. I don't know. Um, but yeah, I don't think that doesn't, as far as what I know about that, which is pretty limited, I don't feel like it had the characteristics of, right, like so a new paradigm starting up has certain specific characteristics. There's a small group of people, or Kuhn would probably say men, right? There's a small group of people who have faith in the new paradigm and are like for one reason or another have been converted to it and are struggling to help it solve its many problems, and at the same time trying to persuade everyone else to join them. Um, and there may well be I mean, for obvious reasons, if the old paradigm wins, you're much less likely to hear about the new paradigm later on, right? So, but so maybe there are examples like that. I just don't know of any, and Kuhn doesn't mention any. But okay, so in any case, that was all a long digression because that was all about what, like, whether you should call it the revolution before it closes, or whether you should just call it a civil war and call it a revolution once you know who won. I mean, I guess sometimes we talk about failed revolutions, so maybe there's some other way of explaining what revolution is and how it's different from any random civil war. I don't know. In any case, um, uh,
There, I mean, there are answers to that question in historiography.
okay. What are the, can you tell me one of the answers?
I think comes up a lot in the history of China because dynasties keep replacing each other, and we don't call that. Um, we rarely call those revolutions, right?
Yeah,
Because it would seem that a civil war, irrespective of who wins, um, fundamentally changes who wields power and not what kind of power they wield, right?
right.
Whereas a revolution, even if it failed, tried to set up a different system of power. So I feel like I don't know, like the moving of say all the important physicists are at one university and then they're at another one. That's kind of a change in domination of the field, but it's not a revolution, even if it involves some kind of power struggle.
I mean, yeah, it's going to be hard to, because in some sense, I think using that criterion, you would say that no scientific revolutions are really revolutions. The system remains the same, right? Uh, it's just a different dynasty. Yeah, I'm not sure, but, um, well, in any case, be that as it may, so um, so the revolution or revolution to be, whichever is the right way to talk about it, the the revolution can't be settled by proof because the two sides talk past each other. So when people switch from one side to the other, it's not because they've been like rationally convinced. It's an instance of conversion. Um, so the assumption here is that, I mean, I take it this is supposed to be, um, I mean, in real life, maybe the term conversion, well, I guess it has more than one source. And certainly one source of the term conversion is what Plato talks about in the Republic, where um, you know, the people down in the cave, the first step of getting them out is to turn them around. That's the conversion. But I don't think Kuhn is thinking of that. He's thinking of Plato. I think he's thinking about religious conversion. And his assumption is that religious conversion is not to be explained by any reasons. Um, which maybe is true and maybe isn't. All right, but in any case, it's like that image of religious conversion that the person afterwards couldn't explain what, or couldn't correctly explain. Maybe they would say something, but it wouldn't really be an explanation of why the change happened. There's no logical explanation. And what is it that brings about the conversion? Well, there's certain claims that are sometimes made, but Kuhn says they're not logically compelling. So, I mean, the most common one is the claim that the new paradigm can solve the problem which led to the crisis, right? Can eliminate the anomaly. I think sometimes Kuhn earlier and I also earlier talked as if that's always what happens. But Kuhn says that's often what happens. Although he adds, sometimes the claim is not even true, right? So he says in the case of Copernicus that Copernicus is that. So again, according to him, the anomaly that really led to the Copernican revolution, and again, let's assume he's right about that. The anomaly that really led to the Copernican revolution was problems about the calendar, calculating the length of the solar year and stuff like that. And Kuhn says, but in fact, Copernicus' system wasn't actually more accurate than the Ptolemaic system it replaced. Um, the new system didn't become much more accurate until after Kepler. So, and Kepler's system is fundamentally different from, right? Because the planets move on elliptical orbits rather than in circles. Um, so sometimes, so that claim is often effective and is often made, but um, it's so far from being a logical explanation for the change that it doesn't even have to be true. um, but then Kuhn also adds, this is on page 154, sometimes the looser practice that characterizes extraordinary research will produce a candidate for paradigm that initially helps not at all with the problems that have evoked crisis. Like sometimes it just solves some other problem and everyone's really impressed. Or it predicts something really unexpected, right? Like the case of the Fresnel spot in the center of a shadow of a circular disk that Kuhn discusses, right? Like the wave theory of light. Fresnel didn't realize this, and who's the person on the other side? Hassan, someone, I don't know. Anyway, that someone pointed out, hey, your wave theory of light is ridiculous because it predicts that if you have a circular disk that casts a shadow, that there'll be a bright spot in the middle. And the bright spot in the middle is because refracted rays add up or whatever. So anyway, so that was supposed to be like showing that Fresnel's theory couldn't be right. But then someone actually bothered to look at the shadow of cast by a circular disk, and sure enough, there was a bright spot in the middle that no one had ever noticed. So Kuhn says that's very effective, right? Even if the wave theory didn't solve the problems that they were having with the corpuscular theory, that thing where you're like, well, that's ridiculous. That would mean there's a bright spot, and you look and there is one. So that triggers conversion. Um, but oftentimes it's Kuhn says it's a big part of it is something aesthetic. Like it's just kind of the new paradigm is kind of cool. That is, it seems that way to a small group of people. Not everyone has to be able to see this. It just has to be enough for because the important thing is enough people have to start working on the new paradigm. The new paradigm starts off maybe solving the old anomaly problem, maybe solving some other problem you didn't expect it, but meanwhile, it has a lot of new problems, right? The fit between it and nature is not very good yet. And we can see why, right? Like from that example of proportions in chemical reactions. As Kuhn says, it's hard to make the paradigm fit the world. You start off with data that wasn't collected with this paradigm in mind, and it's not likely to fit it. So there have to be enough people to start working on the paradigm to get it to solve more problems. Um, and Kuhn says this kind of aesthetic consideration can often be, um, be the thing that shifts the balance, at least for that small group. He says to this day, general relativity, I mean, I think that's less true now than it was in 1962. But he says that to this day, general relativity is accepted to its aesthetic appeal, even though very few people can appreciate that aesthetic appeal. um, so um, this is similar to the remark I just made about conversion. There's an assumption here that aesthetic appeal is subjective and irrational. Right? I mean, Kuhn doesn't argue for that. He assumes you agree with him about that. That it can't be the case that something is objectively aesthetically better than another. Aesthetic appeal is just a matter of my preferences. Um, if that's right, it causes a lot of problems with the history of mathematics and physics. Uh, it's this is something I've actually been thinking about for many years. But it was um, a problem first raised by Mark Steiner about the applicability of mathematics. That if you ask, for example, like take the example of conic sections. So mathematicians in antiquity were interested in conic sections. In mathematics, like it's easy to find things that are true. It's hard to find things that are interesting, right? So like there are lots of possible curves like this that you could prove things about if you wanted to, but no one would care because it's not interesting, right? But conic sections, mathematicians already in antiquity found very interesting, and that's why they proved all these things about them. They had no idea that these could have any physical application. And then, like thousands of years later, literally, Kepler comes along and is trying to replace circles and lines, which is what Aristotelian dynamics has, with something else. And what does he guess? Not this. Right? He guesses, oh, maybe it's conic sections. That's not exactly right, because it's perturbations, but it's very, very close, right? So, um, isn't that a weird coincidence that the thing that mathematicians found aesthetically pleasing thousands of years ago turns out to be the useful geometry for advancing astronomy? And there's other examples like that. So anyway, and that I think that's kind of distinct from the all the questions that Kuhn is asking. I think that's a distinct problem. But in any case, so these are things that at least Kuhn thinks are can be effective in causing someone to convert, but can't possibly constitute a logical reason to accept the new paradigm instead of the old one. So basically, all this stuff, including the claims about problem solving of the new paradigm, is a kind of propaganda in a pejorative sense of propaganda. Um, Ray, as Kuhn says, this is on page 157. Um, um, I can't find this, but it is on page 157. Paradigm debates are not really about relative problem solving ability, though for good reasons they are usually couched in those terms. Right? So the point that, so he's saying there's a good reason to say my paradigm solves problems better. My new paradigm solves problems better. There's a good reason to say that, even though, number one, he's saying the debate's not really about that, right? That was the first part of the sentence. Paradigm debates are not really about relative problem solving ability. So it's irrelevant. um, and it might not even be true, right? So what kind of good reasons can there be for saying things that are irrelevant and might not even be true? Well, I mean, they're the kind of reasons for, as Kuhn says elsewhere, the techniques of mass persuasion, right? They're the kind of reasons there can be for saying things when you don't care uh, why people accept something, you just want to manipulate them into accepting it. So then you don't care whether what you're saying is really relevant and you don't care if it's true. Um, Now, I don't think Kuhn thinks that the scientists doing this realize that that's going on. I mean, I think that's true of political propaganda a lot of times too. The people saying it themselves believe it, right? But um, but to whom? To Kuhn as an external authority, so to speak. It's evident that um, um, these things are just being claimed without any regard to logic or truth for the purpose of converting more people to our paradigm. And Kuhn says ultimately the decision must be made on faith, meaning made on faith. So again, the assumption here is that, or the understanding of faith here is like if you're in my 100C, you probably remember, or any 100C, you might remember Locke's discussion of faith, right? Where Locke says, like, faith means that you have good reason to believe what someone else told you. So it's right, like from that point of view, faith is totally subordinate to logic. It's just a specific type of question that you're now trying to answer. Should I believe what it says in this book? Should I believe what this person told me about this book? Whatever. But Kuhn's understanding of faith here is that, and you know, if you're in 106, you know Kant has another completely different discussion, understanding of faith. But Kuhn's understanding is that accepting something on faith means you accept it without any good reason. Um, uh, and there's a psychological explanation, but there's no reason. And that's how scientific revolutions happen. Okay, so this, I think, is the end of the discussion of the demarcation problem. Basically, right? Like we've now seen all like what Kuhn thinks characterizes science, how normal science works, how extraordinary science comes about, how revolution starts and how it ends. And the fields that have all those things are mature sciences. And of course, it's not just a random list of things. They're all supposed to follow from one principle. And the principle is basically the principle of unified paradigm that can serve as a basis for puzzle solving. Um, but this leaves us with some questions. And the main question, I think, is, but first of all, I should say, are there questions about this before I go on? No. All right. So the main question is the question that got us interested in the demarcation problem to begin with. Namely, why does science make progress? Right? As I've been claiming throughout the whole course, the reason there is a philosophical problem about science, about mature science, or what I call modern science right now. I mean, my concepts don't exactly line up with Kuhn's. Right? It's incommensurable. Kuhn counts ancient astronomy as a mature science, for example. But roughly speaking, you want to know, why does a mature science make progress in a way that other fields don't? Um, so, you know, an inductivist or a Popperian, well, inductivist has a clear answer to that if inductivism worked, right? That's what I discussed when I talked about Popper's explanation of why science makes progress, that Popper already has a problem with this because the inductivist explanation seems much clearer. But Popper also has his explanation for why there's progress. And it's, you know, I mean, what the progress is in and why there's progress, right? So the progress is in coming up with bolder and bolder conjectures that have not yet been falsified that we can now test. Um, and there's already some question, which we saw Putnam among other people raising, that like, well, wait, why is that useful? Why is that a useful kind of progress? But I think Kuhn's attack on Popper makes this problem even more pressing because it's not clear why we should expect this activity to make any kind of progress. That's what he has to explain. So first of all, he has a list of disciplines or types of discipline that do make progress, and he has another list of the ones that don't. So the ones that do make progress are science, and again, this means mature science or natural science. Basically, he thinks the natural sciences are mature and the social sciences are not mature. Um, so science and technology. He doesn't explain why technology makes progress. Um, I mean, you might have thought that technology makes progress because of science. Right? I mean, I think like Putnam is and it's not particular to Putnam, but Putnam is, I think, almost like takes that for granted, right? Like an explanation of scientific progress has to explain why science has made better and better technology possible. Um, but what Kuhn says about technology, Kuhn says every civilization we know of has had technology. Did he say every? I think he says civilization. I don't know if I can find that page now. Or does he say every society? That might make a big difference. But anyway, in this case, I think it's true no matter which way you say it, right? Every society we know of has had technology. Every civilization we know of has had technology, right? Even like crows have technology. I don't know if theirs is making progress or not, but maybe it is slowly, right? So, uh, um, whereas Kuhn says only the civilizations deriving from Hellenic Greece. That Hellenic, like Hellenic means Greek, right? So it's like Greece. But anyway, only the civilizations deriving from Hellenic Greece have the type of um, um, discipline or creative field that we call mature science, or have more than the most rudimentary beginnings of it, or something like that. Now, I mean, my point here is not to rate, because that obviously could be a very controversial statement. Like what about Chinese science? Is it really just rudimentary? Is it blah blah blah, right? But or um, but what?
I'm just thinking Ptolemaic astronomy is a mature science, then Ayurveda has got to be a mature science. They're both wrong about most things, but
I
both have laws.
Yeah, so like I said, I don't mean to defend this, and I don't know how much Kuhn knew about non-Western science at this point. But my point here is not to either defend or attack that thesis. It's just to point out what Kuhn must think about the relation here, right? Because if every society has technology and technology makes progress, but most societies don't have science, then Kuhn must think that technological progress does not depend on science. Uh, so that's, I mean, some people have argued for that more explicitly than Kuhn. It's not a ridiculous position. Um, they'll say like the steam engine was developed by tinkering with parts and like science had to follow along and give the physics to explain it. It wasn't the other way around. Someone didn't calculate that a steam engine would work and then someone built it. Which I think, I mean, from what I've heard, that's probably true of the steam engine. I don't know if it's true of, you know, like why this computer works. Like if there were no quantum mechanics, could anyone have ever figured out by tinkering how to put it together? Um, like an LCD screen, right? Like it wasn't invented by tinkering, I don't think. Well, I don't know. Anyway, but that must be what Kuhn thinks. So he doesn't, so technology doesn't make progress because of science. Why does it make progress? Well, um, you could say it's like science, it's a kind of natural selection process. Um, but natural selection for what? Right? Like what's the fitness criterion? So for mature science, the fitness criterion is how many good puzzles it provides. For technology, presumably the fitness criterion is how useful it is. And that raises certain questions about, you know, don't don't new technologies change our concept of what is useful and what isn't? But leaving that aside, maybe it shouldn't be left aside. Maybe it wasn't left aside. These cases will look more parallel. I don't know, or could look, depending on what you said about that, could look more parallel. But any case, I mean, you might think, yeah, it's just how useful it is. So, and if that's true, then progress in technology would be a great thing, right? Because we have more and more useful stuff. Whereas progress in science would be useful to scientists who like puzzle solving. That's it. Right. So, okay. But anyway, then there's also a list of disciplines that don't make progress. And one of them is art. And one of them is political theory. So is this as opposed to political practice? Like political practice does make progress? Because remember, he has this analogy between scientific revolution and political revolution. Um, the progress is going to be more like the progress of science than the progress of technology, presumably. But anyway, art, political theory, and philosophy are listed as disciplines that don't make progress. And again, you have to ask here, like, you mean like until Kuhn? Because he seems to claim that he's introducing a paradigm. But okay, so then leaving aside the question of that he doesn't address of why technology makes progress, go back to the question that he does talk about. So why do mature sciences make progress? And so the answer has to be divided between normal science and revolutions. Um, so yeah. So for normal science, um, there's kind of two answers. One is a general answer. This general answer is on page 162. Resolution will depend in part upon resolution of what? Resolution of the, I guess, like puzzlement we have about why science so described should make progress. So it says resolution will depend in part upon an inversion of our normal view of the relation between scientific activity and the community that practices it. We must learn to recognize as causes what have ordinarily been taken to be effects. So, so what is the thing that is a cause that's ordinarily been taken to be an effect? So the first thing is, and this is what he goes on to discuss on page 162, that he says, of course, every school always makes progress by its own lights. Every creative field makes progress by its own lights, because he says the field can't both accept something as a valuable contribution and not regard it as progress. Now, historically speaking, I feel like this is not right. That, like, historically speaking, a lot of, maybe most kind of traditions or fields have regarded themselves as degenerating, right? It was like our ancestors who were really great, and our new contributions are not so good, right? Like, we'll never live up to them. um, it's probably a more common attitude than we're making progress. Um, but and you might also ask, what about contemporary art? Well, maybe it's different now than it was in 1962. And there certainly was a period when modern artists felt like they were in their various schools, felt like they were making progress, right? So there's like an avant-garde, or whatever. I'm not sure if that's still true now. Um, But anyway, so the answer is supposedly every school always makes progress according to itself. And from this point of view, the only difference in the mature science is that all the schools except one have been killed off. So, um, so the one surviving school is the only one that can tell us whether there's been progress or not. And of course, it always says that there's been progress because it's judging itself. Um, that is, as long as normal science continues, right? I mean, because when extraordinary science starts, the scientists are unhappy and they feel like things are unsettled, and um, but as long as normal science keeps working, every new solution to a puzzle that's accepted as a good solution is a sign of progress. Um, So that's like an explanation that would apply to anything as long as there was only one school. But then he gives two other explanations that are specific to science, I guess, or does he really feel like any creative field would also gain these characteristics if it could kill off all but one school? I don't know. But so one is the insulated nature of mature science. This is what he discusses on page 164. Um, so the insulation means that scientists can choose which type of problems to attack. Um, as opposed to, for example, engineers or doctors. Now, it's weird that that's technology. So again, there has to be a different explanation for why technology makes progress. But anyway, as opposed to engineers or doctors or social scientists or quote unquote theologians, Kuhn talks about theologians a lot, but I'm not sure exactly who he has in mind here. But anyway, um, they have to solve the problems that everyone wants them to solve. They don't get to choose which problems to work on, but the scientists get to choose which problems to work on. Now, I think again, there's kind of a cause effect inversion here. Like, um, it's really, um, it's really because what scientists are doing is puzzle solving that's only of interest to them and their colleagues that they get to be insulated. I think that's what Kuhn means. So it's not like, fortunately, people decided to leave them alone and that's why they're able to do this. It's because after the first dominant paradigm, the science quickly becomes more and more esoteric as people try to solve more and more esoteric puzzles, and it becomes less and less interesting or accessible to anyone else. And so no one's in a position to tell them what to do. Um, but anyway, Kuhn says, so they choose the type of problem that they feel assured has a solution. Now, I mean, they can be wrong about that, but still, Kuhn says, who do you expect to make more progress? Someone who chooses problems based on which they think can be solved, or someone who chooses problems based on how important they are? So, the ones that are more important are probably the harder ones to solve. So that's an additional explanation of why normal science makes progress more rapidly. Right. So like even if there could be a kind, and again, I'm not sure if he thinks there can be or not, but if there could be a kind of creative field that's dominated by one school but doesn't have this insulation, then it would still make progress by its own lights, but it would make progress more slowly because it would constantly be trying to solve problems that it's not sure really have a solution. Um, And then the third reason he gives is ignorance of history. He discusses this on page 164 to 165. Right? He says, in music, art, music isn't art, but I don't know, music, other kinds of art. um, in music, uh, um, art, to a large extent in philosophy and even in social sciences, um, this is on page 165, but again, I can't find it. The pagination hasn't changed in this book or something.
I think pagination on campus has usually been very slightly different to the copy that I have.
Yeah, because this is not my old copy because I couldn't find my old copy and I bought a new one. Maybe it's changed. That's annoying. It's because it's still the 50th anniversary edition. It's the same edition. It should have the same pagination, right? Well, I don't know. Anyway, fortunately, I have a copy down in my notes here. Sometimes I like to read out of the book. It feels more, I don't know, authentic. But all right. Anyway, this is what he says on page 165. In those areas, the student, quote, has always before him a number of competing and incommensurable solutions to these problems. That is, to the many different things that have been considered problems, as he says in context, right? So the student has access both to the many different kinds of problems that people in discipline have worked on and to a number of competing and incommensurable solutions to these problems, solutions that he must ultimately evaluate for himself. Um, so that interferes with making progress because you're always having, even in the absence of any like existing competing school, you're always being exposed to people who aren't members of your school. So um, there's always a danger that you'll be reduced back to thinking about the fundamentals, right? But why do we really think that, you know, um, I don't know, what's the right question in some of these cases? It's hard to say, but in philosophy, you might say, well, why do we really think that everything we know comes from our senses? Or, something like that, right? So, um, whereas in um, in the sciences, the um, um, instruction is through recently written textbooks, and they allude to history only briefly and inaccurately. Right? And in particular, the fundamental inaccuracy is that they make all the preceding scientists look as if they were working within the current paradigm. So you never get exposed to someone who's solving a different kind of problem or who has an incommensurable type of solution to a problem. Um, I think, well, first of all, without necessarily agreeing with Kuhn's diagnosis of why this works, the logical positivists, especially, uh, at some point said that, um, I mean, as we saw in Carnap, right? He said we want to get to a stage where philosophy is making progress the way the sciences do. So everyone doesn't build up their own system over again, right, every time. And part of the solution to that was that philosophy should become like science in this respect, that the history of philosophy would be a concern of someone else, not of philosophers, right? Just like the history of science is the concern of someone else, not of scientists. However, they didn't succeed in making that happen. Right? As you can see, for example, our department still requires history courses. Most departments do. Um, and they're not taught from textbooks. Um, you have to read Descartes. So, I do think that philosophy now has tried to, I don't know, it's like they kind of didn't succeed, but they half did succeed in the sense that history of philosophy is now regarded as a different specialty than contemporary philosophy. Right. And then history of philosophy is divided. And it's not divided by area, but it's divided by time period. Right. Um, so at least the professional organization of the field is such as to like really limit the extent to which someone working now in metaphysics has to worry about the history of metaphysics. There isn't even such a specialty as history of metaphysics, right? Rather, there's like history of 17th century philosophy focusing on so and so. Um, so and to some extent that's reflected in our courses too, although as you can tell just by asking this question, I'm kind of refusing to play along with that. But um uh so um so what? According to Kuhn, that would mean that philosophy should start to make rapid progress. I don't think that's been the result. um I think you'll find if you look at current journal articles in philosophy that yes, although they're very insulated and super specialized, they are still continually going back to the foundations and arguing about first principles. Um, so I don't know, that may mean that there's something wrong with this diagnosis. Not to mention there's something wrong with philosophy, but anyway, okay, so that's the explanation for why there's progress through normal science. Then the question is, what about progress through revolutions? So when we finally get to the explanation of why there's progress through revolutions, it's kind of anticlimactic, right? It's uh, number one, uh, of course, the outcome of the revolution has to look like progress to the victors. Right? I mean, otherwise they would be admitting that they were wrong. They've committed to the new paradigm. Obviously, they have to think the new paradigm is better than the old paradigm. And because of that thing I just finished saying about scientific education, um, or yeah, again, actually, it's not clear which is the cause and which is the effect here. But anyway, they have this kind of Orwellian control over history, right? Like, there's no one within the scientific discipline who is going to suggest or even knows about the possibility of a different standard according to which the old paradigm was better. And Kuhn says, at least up until now, that is, up until him, the same has really been true for most historians of science too, right? That they've written what people call Whig history. Right? Do you know that term, Whig history? It's right, like it's because of the way the Whigs in England wrote the history of England as like you know, a series. It's always getting better and leading up to them. Right. So yeah, so the history of science, if scientists even paid attention to it, would actually wouldn't, provide a check to this. Um, but of course, scientists as such are usually, some scientists are interested in their history of science, but that's like a side interest, right? It's just like, as Plato or Aristotle would say, a flute player can be a horse rider, but not Quay flute player. It's just they're accidentally identical. Right. Um, So that's a big part of the answer. Why is there progress through revolutions? Well, the only person deciding whether there's progress is the person who's been converted to the new paradigm and the people who have read history that's passed through those hands, right? And so, of course, it's going to look like there was progress. Um, and I mean, and lay people, of course, are in no position to, unless they're reading Kuhn, are in no position to think otherwise, right? Because science is insulated. It's insulated, it's esoteric. Um, uh, um, no one who isn't themselves part of the professional field can have a well-informed opinion about whether there's been progress. I mean, of course, they can have an ill-informed opinion, right? Like all the people who are still trying to prove that special relativity is false because there's a paradox, right? Um, uh, but uh, but there's no like well-informed critic out there. So that's a big part of the answer. Um, but Kuhn says that's not the whole answer. A second part of the answer is the paradigm is the new paradigm is chosen because it seems to or is seen to solve more problems than the old paradigm. Um, um, that's a little bit worrying because it seems it's chosen because it was Kuhn says that's not really why it was chosen. um, um, but I guess the idea is something like so yeah, it's not always true, but on the whole, usually we'll choose a new paradigm that solves a big part of can still solve a big part of the problems that the old one solved and can also solve some new ones. So this is kind of like Popper's quasi-induction, uh, only it's kind of like more inadvertent, right? That even though the science isn't really cumulative, the effect looks kind of cumulative just because the criteria for choosing a new paradigm on the whole, will choose paradigms that can solve more puzzles or can solve puzzles more precisely or something like that. Um, and all of these things basically, I think, this is actually what Kuhn emphasizes in his what's it called? Postscript, right? Postscript 1969, which I didn't assign. Um, that that really, in some ways, more fundamental than the idea of paradigm is the idea of a scientific community. Um, that um, it's really the insulation of the scientific community. Um, um, the insulation of the scientific community is it's confusing. I just said it's because they're solving puzzles. That's why they're insulated. Puzzles, puzzle solving is usually not a spectator sport, for one thing, right? Like it's even leaving aside the esotericism aspect of it, it's not really very interesting to watch someone else solve a crossword puzzle or something, right? The interest is in doing it yourself. Yeah.
Or you have like 3D puzzles, word games, things like that. I don't know, puzzles, right? Like I watch competitive Scrabble.
If it's competitive, that's different, right? But solving a puzzle, because
Science is sometimes kind of a competitive spectacle, right?
yeah,
When labs have raced each other to certain particles. I mean, not like formally, but
yeah, no, there is competition sometimes. Um, Mostly, you see, there's competition, I think, mostly when there aren't enough puzzles. At least that's how Kuhn would describe it. When the, what?
they get antsy and you need to put more engagement in their enclosure.
Well, yeah, I mean, because so speaking from my own experience in astrophysics, um, which I mean only went so far. I was a grad student, right? So, but the like astrophysics, when I knew it, was not extremely competitive. And I think the reason is there was a lot more problems to work on than there were people to available to work on them, right? And there was like tons of data. I think there's even more now, much more, right? There's like tons of data that no one had ever looked at. And yeah, so I think it's when you get a science where either like particle physics where there's like only so many things you can work on and they're very expensive Um, or when like everyone's focused on one thing, not really an anomaly, but still a kind of problem that engrosses everyone, like the structure of DNA did, I guess, at some point. Uh, I think that's where the competition comes from. And it's more a competition about it's it's not so much who will solve the puzzle fastest, is it who will get to solve it at all. Because if I can't solve this puzzle, there aren't any others out there to solve, right? So it's like we were fighting over the crossword puzzle in the New York Times. Who will get to solve it? um, uh, yeah. Um, but on the other hand, I guess you could say um, the the insulation. I mean, maybe this isn't so weird. I mean, remember, Kuhn says this is a very unusual thing. It's only happened in this one like group of civilizations. Um, it's uh, um, meaning that uh, like the society as a whole has to be set up in such a way as to let this get off the ground. Um, and that might be unusual because if the insulation can't start, I mean, so like after a while it kind of protects itself. But if the insulation can't start, then there can't be puzzles. Um, so this, well, at least was on page 168. Yeah, so I should like I when I wrote most of these notes, I changed them a little bit this year. I change them a little bit every year. When I wrote most of them, I had a different copy of the book, and now it seems like the pages in that copy were different. But at least what used to be page 168. Um, he says that the professional class, quote, must be seen as the sole possessors of the rules of the game or of some equivalent basis for unequivocal judgments. Right. So, and um, that's necessary for the activity of puzzle solving to get going. We can't have other people suddenly telling us that no, you're not following the right rules. Um, right. I guess there's a similar question about this, which is um, why is it Kuhn says that it's an unwritten rule of science that you don't solve a scientific debate by asking the head of state to intervene? There have been some instances where people have done just that. Perhaps one is going on right now with vaccines. But or is that really technology, I guess? I don't know. But in any case, Kuhn says there's an unwritten rule that you don't do that. Um, is it that um, so you might think scientists don't do that because they think that only scientists are qualified to decide who should win the scientific dispute. Um, right? They think they know their own business and more than anyone else, and and they know how to make progress, and other people don't. And that's why you can only appeal to peer review, right? It has to be your professional peers who decide. Um, but on the other hand, you might think that um, it's only because science has been successful in not letting outside people control it that it's come into this state where it quote unquote knows its own business, that is able to hold itself exclusively to its own standards. Um, and again, I think maybe Kuhn thinks it's both. Right? It's like on the one hand, there has to be a certain amount of luck or correct circumstances, um, without which a group like this couldn't get started because the head of state would always be interfering or other outside authorities. Um, but on the other hand, it's true that the nature of the activity of puzzle solving under a paradigm is that you're like automatically uninterested in what other people outside the community would have to say about it. Um, right. And so in the end, Kuhn says, yes, science makes progress, but the definition of progress is in the long run, it's essentially this, that the current paradigm, um, unlike previous ones, assures us that we can solve the problems that we're assured we can solve. And we're assured we can solve them because this is the current paradigm. Right? So we have this paradigm that it can solve all the problems, or not all the problems. It can solve a lot of the problems that it assures us it can solve. The previous paradigms couldn't assure us of solving those problems, not as many of them anyway, on the whole. And so, of course, there's been progress. But Kuhn says, if you want progress in another sense, namely that science is getting closer to the truth about the world, says, well, we probably have to give that up. Right? That's, that was part of the old epistemological paradigm or something. We just have to give that up. Um, I mean, it's a feature of a lot of views that say, and not that there isn't something that can be said about this, but um, not that there isn't some defense that could be made about this, but it's a feature of a lot of views that say that there hasn't really been progress in finding out the truth about the world, that they also say, we used to think there was progress in finding out the truth about the world, but now we know that there isn't, right? Thereby apparently undermining their thesis. So, right? Like, I mean, because isn't Kuhn saying that his new paradigm is telling, I mean, he certainly says that in so many words, right? That this is, fits better with the actual contents of the history of science or something like that. Um, um, so, right. So, um, I guess, um, this just gets into the last question that I want to discuss about Kuhn, which is, okay, so what does he think he's doing and why? And why is he telling us all this stuff? And I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I just have the question, like how hard the question is because of all the stuff I've just been saying. Um, um, is he somehow being ironic? Is he not telling us certain things? And perhaps, I mean, I kind of hinted at this before, but I don't think it fits all the pieces together. So, you might think he thinks something like this. Um, Starting a political revolution. This is actually similar to what Descartes says in the discourse, but it's not clear that Descartes is serious about that. But anyway, right, starting a political revolution. Actually, it's not exactly what Descartes. Well, never mind. Never mind Descartes. Starting a political revolution is pointless because political revolutions don't make progress any more than scientific revolutions do. I mean, they do make progress in the same sense that scientific revolutions do, namely that the victors write the history, essentially. But why should you want that? So therefore, Kuhn is not going to write a book saying, hey, you know, this way we're doing science, it's oppressive and bad, you should stop doing it. Right? Because, like, that's an attempt to make a political revolution. But instead, he's going to hint to you, if you're a scientist, like, would you rather, you know, be making a picture the way a child or a contemporary artist does? um, right. So, like, that's the only level at which he can offer us help. Might be one way of understanding this. And then you would have to understand the later stuff where he kind of tries to backpedal on the relativism and other things like that, as well. Either he changed his mind or that's just more cover. That's like more ironic cover. um, but I'm not satisfied with that interpretation. I mean, I guess you could also say he's just really confused and he didn't realize that he undermined himself by saying that. But that's hard for me to believe too. So I don't know what to tell you about Kuhn in the end. Um, um, but just as um, addendum to the whole course, there's one other question I want to discuss, which is, so what about this thing about mature science? And I mentioned this before, right? The assumption is, Kuhn's assumption is an assumption. He doesn't really argue for it. Any creative field can make this transition to becoming a normal science. And eventually they all will, I think, is what he suggests. You know, that someday the social sciences, maybe it's even happening right now, right? Um, so that what? Well, it's not just Carnapian. I mean, right, like a lot of people in this period, but not only in this period. I mean, Aristotle says something like this in the Metaphysics, that yeah, that you know, field by field, they'll eventually become like the natural sciences. Yeah.
But he also seems to like kind of suggest that it going the other direction too.
He says that you never go in the other direction, but he seems to give an example of art. Yeah. So again, I don't know how to. I I'm not going to talk more about tune and interpretation though now. I only have 4 minutes left, so I can talk about something else. But that um so like, is that right? In other words, is the difference between physics and sociology mostly a difference of like what stage they're at? That's what this terminology of mature versus immature implies. Um, so, you know, Kuhn gives this example about economics. He says, you know, why do economists worry less about the definition of science than other social scientists do? Um, he says, is it because they know more about science? Or is it because they're more agreed about the definition of science? Or is it because they're agreed about economics? Right? And of course, he suggests it's the latter, right? It's because um, because they're more like a normal science. There's more agreement among them about what are the important problems and how they can be attacked and whatever, that therefore they're not so involved in this question about uh, what we're doing a science and what's the meaning of science. Um, but um, it seems to me that this might be putting the cart before the horse. That, like, economists can agree about economics more than sociologists can agree about sociology, because economics as an entity is not a very important economic subject. I mean, it is one, right? And economists sometimes talk about this, the economics of economics, right? Like,
how, right, how is the field of economics economically organized? But it's not like, um, that's not a major portion of the world economy. Right? Sociology, I mean, right, we just heard Kuhn saying, like, there's something weird about our culture. We have weird things that we do. Sociology and anthropology are among them, probably. Right? I mean, like, again, not to raise the question, is there is there Chinese anthropology? Is there, but it seems like there's something that we do there that's weird. And so, like, that's an actually really important sociological or anthropological question. What about our society gives rise to sociology? And what's the social organization of sociology? Sociologists can't just like leave that aside, right? It's not like economists can be like, oh, haha, let's talk about the now contrast both of them with physics. I mean, physics is a physical entity, right? Like, if you wanted to ask how much physics is there, this somehow came up on Facebook. Like, does that question make sense? And I said, like, well, sure. I mean, just get a giant graduated cylinder and with water in it and like dump all the physicists in and see how much but
Have to put in the colliders too.
well, I don't know. That'd be a question. How much you would have to put in? Yeah, but
Instruments are part of the parish.
right. But the point is, so yes, physics is a physical system, but it's not at all an interesting physical system, right? It's much less than economics is an interesting economic system. Um, it's it's like physics isn't really a physical concept, right? It's just from a point of view of physics, it's a random assortment of objects, right? So, and then contrast all of this with philosophy, right? So I guess like, could philosophy ever stop worrying about the definition of philosophy? Like, wouldn't it not be philosophy anymore if that happened? Might be happening now, but um, so, well,
I don't think that.
well, no, a lot of it does.
A lot of it has always sucked is the thing.
Exactly,
But
right.
I think
That's the question.
I think a lot of
Yeah.
physics has always sucked and probably does now, just not in ways we're presently equipped to recognize.
Oh, no, sure. No, I mean, if you ask, like, I mean, I can talk about astrophysics that, I mean, like my professors warned me, like, oh yeah, a lot of the papers in the journals are junk. You have to know who the authors are and trust them. Yeah, in every field, a lot of it is junk. In mathematics too, right? It's not wrong, but it's uninteresting. Right. So anyway, I'm out of time and out of time for the whole course, but so that's just like a last thought that I have that maybe that I think that's basically going back to the question I started the course with. Why is science not philosophy, and why does that help it progress? But maybe we should be thinking in this direction. Okay, thank you. And I will see you all at the final, I guess. Ugh, I'm not looking forward to that, but it will be short. All right, I'll see you then. Bye.